Hey guys, Manga here with a new video on how to draw clothes, folds, wrinkles, and all that good stuff, which will help you in your character designs for your characters, your stories, whatever it may be. To me, the best way to learn how to draw clothes is to actually study from life and study from maybe illustrations that you like, studying like clothing patterns and things that happen, things that don't, practicing with reference with the goal of knowing how to draw without reference. Here, I'm only sharing my studies and tips to help you guys get better at drawing clothing and practice to improve your cloth drawing skills. Study and understand the basic ideas behind folds and wrinkles and why and when they happen and more. Studying this also helps you build familiarity with the audience when they compare what you have subconsciously to clothes they've actually seen. It helps sell that what you're actually drawing is in fact clothing. We're going to talk about things you should look out for, things you should be aware of, and I'll share my studies as simplified tips for you, and then see me apply most of them, in an illustration here and there for a clothed character we would have as a model. So, we'll have fun drawing a couple characters here and there and put some clothes on them. Sketch what's underneath the material first. Think in layers. The body or object underneath helps dictate how the material cloth would fold or act. Going this route alleviates some of the thought process, of the material's action with respect to the object underneath. This is basically thinking in steps. Like, you don't know how the cloth is going to fold or act or do whatever, have wrinkles. You don't know where those wrinkles are going to be placed if you don't know the position of, say, the body. If we're talking about a character wearing clothes, you want to know exactly how the character is going to be positioned so you know exactly where, or have a good idea, a strong idea of where the clothes and the wrinkles and folds are going to be positioned, accuracy wise. And so here I already have the characters already figured out, like their poses and their positions already figured out. So it makes things a whole lot more easy for me just slapping on the clothes for them. It's almost like a naked mannequin, and then now you're just dressing up the character. And so I already have experience studying illustrations with characters in similar poses, say here with the characters in a similar position with their hands, and just in real life as well, and understanding my style and I guess the style I want to depict it in, to be more specific, so I know how I want to depict this. I know how I want to draw this up, and so it's easy for me to do what I want here, knowing where I want like the streamlines, knowing where I want stretch lines to indicate folds and bumps. And this also comes with practice. Now putting in, just a little shading for the tie. And there's certain things with knowing where to put all these lines, and I'll get to them in later tips, so just give me a sec. Here we have like a skirt, like a schoolgirl skirt, and those lines, they don't all have to connect, they just have to show enough to indicate what's going on. So you have those type of schoolgirl skirts. Again, some of this would come with practice, but it's one of those skirts that, with a little more motion, they stretch, but once they are together, the way her legs are, it's more in unison. And now I can go to the layer underneath to erase parts of the lines that I don't want. With future tips, we will kind of go through all the things that you need to know that will help you understand further where to put these lines, where to put those bumps, and the list goes on, just to make you better prepared to depict clothing in this way. Second tip, the thinner the material, the easier it will fold, move, normally or with the wind, crease, wrinkle, etc. For example, silky material are more likely to fold than, say, jeans or much thicker material. The more likely they are to fold, the more likely those folds will show in an illustration when the opportunity to do so presents itself. Obviously, vice versa, heavier materials are less likely to do much visually in terms of folding. And so here we have this a little more loose, and there's a slight breeze there pushing it towards our right when it comes to like pushing the cloth towards the direction the character is holding up. And you have those kind of lines that go originating from where the touch is going to be, where the character touches the cloth, and that can help dictate where those lines go. But here there's going to be a whole lot more shading, there's going to be a lot more lines, there's going to be a lot more motion with the cloth, indicating that wind is blowing because the cloth is light. So you want to keep that in mind, and it will be much different when you have much heavier material. So here I'm just showing where all the folds could be, shading, because shading also helps show, you know, depth and volume with the material. And also the illustration, when you're drawing certain parts of the lines, can also let you know that it's very thin. And I'll go into more detail about that as we go on with the illustration. So here I'm changing it up to be something a little heavier, and because it's heavier, the wind is not blowing it as much. The connection for both hands is a little more straight as well. It's not falling, it's not really doing a little curve down as much as well, because gravity is not pulling it down as much. And then you still have lines that originate from the point of touch, which I'll go into in a later tip, but the lines are not as long, they're not as visually strong, but they're there. And there's like still shading but less shading, and the breeze is not blowing it that much to the left, only a little bit. I even have streamlines, dotted streamlines, to help indicate something a little more jeans as well. Sometimes the way you shade it helps indicate what kind of material it is, and these are the things to keep in mind. Now if you want to try something thicker, or maybe not necessarily heavier, but at least looks thicker, I'm trying to do with a towel that's kind of rolled up a little bit, and that would change in the way we shade and do all sorts of things. But as you can see, I'm trying to draw a towel this time, and similar to the jeans, it's not moving too much with the wind. The point of touch, the stretch lines that come from there are almost like they're there, but they're not as visible, especially because the top is rolled up. The edges are, you know, to indicate something similar to towels. The edges are not like the whole towel is kind of folded and then rolled up at the top. So things are done very differently here. It's going to be much heavier. The breeze is not going to blow it as easily unless the wind is much stronger and heavier than the material itself. And then it's shaded differently. The stretch lines are done differently. The folds, the bumps are done differently. Third tip is that tight fitted clothes tend to be more consistent with what's underneath, with a few bumps and folds, especially in parts where the body moves or bends. In some cases, it may be so consistent, like skin tight suits, to where there are next to no bumps at all. The way the material folds also depends on the material itself. Quick recall to tip 1. And also the clothing material tends to be too stretched if the fit is too tight. This can be very visible in things like buttons, or when Dr. Banner is turning into the Hulk. You see the clothes stretch and tear, you know, things like that. Seems very logical, so you have to apply a sense of, you know, logic to these basic things. So here we have another character, and I'm going to split it in half, where half of the character we're going to see more fitted clothes, and more fitted clothing at least, and then for the other side we'll have something a whole lot more loose. So here we have a bump, again, right before the biceps. There are usually some bumps there, at least one, and then you have some lines kind of in that direction of the bump, and they're gonna have a lot of like lines, and there's some usual places where you find these, like I said, under the armpits, places where the character bends, so jointed areas of the body, you'll find these lines there. But here the cloth is much in tune with the skin, like not much is changing. There isn't that thick an extra layer on his body, versus what we will have on the left, especially in the arm area, that will help change things. But everything right now is pretty much tight. These designs, obviously these characters are from My Hero Academia, and so I already know how these designs look. I'm not spending a lot of time actually designing the character. So here you have some fashion type stuff that is part of studies that you can apply. Something fluffy in the collar area, and there is a specific way you have to do those. It's almost like upside down drapes, but tiny at the top, and they flow, doing like a cosine motion. For math people, you kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about, but there's a certain way to do that. And when it comes to certain things and the way to draw certain clothes, I'll leave those for more specific videos where maybe you want to learn how to draw a specific type of clothing. But here I just want to focus more on, I guess, what I would like to call principles of things. These are more design type stuff, and we will get to them. Tip 4. The more loose fitted the clothing is, the more it will tend to bring a new shape versus the object that's underneath. Again, versus what we had before, it's almost reshaping how the arm would look. You don't know what's underneath. With the what's on the right, we have a good idea of how his arm is shaped, but what's on the left completely reshapes it, right? Because it's much more loose material. It's a similar length, right? But it's a whole lot looser, and then everything else will be different. And the way I'm putting in the bumps, the stretch lines, and all of that stuff is completely different. And these are things to watch out for, because I see people where it's supposed to be loose material, but they're still trying to make it or they're afraid of making it really loose, or they're still trying to make parts of it be in tune with what's underneath, and that doesn't need to be like, it doesn't need to be that way all the time. Again, we'll get to more discussion of where to put these lines, where to put the bumps, and all that kind of stuff. Tip 5, the stretch and fold lines and bumps tend to originate from the point of touch or motion. Some usual suspects are, under tuck-ins, belt areas, where the cape begins, armpits, crotch areas, the joints where your leg bends or where your arm bends, around the elbows, places like that. And there are next to no stretch lines where the material seems to be one with what's underneath. And then parts of the material that have to do with less movement or less touch and things of that nature would obviously experience less folds, stretch lines, and things of that nature. So parts that don't bend, parts that don't rarely move, you only see if there was a point of touch. So like a character wearing a regular shirt, like the front side of the shirt might have folds here and there, but it will have way less folds than, say, in the armpit area, unless maybe somebody touches that point, and then you see folds kind of surrounding that area, that point of contact. And then obviously if you're dealing with things like animation where you have to draw several parts on several frames, the folds will continue to change based on the positioning of the object underneath the material. So as you can see here, we have this character bending his limbs, both knees and arms, and then the fold lines and bumps would mostly be found at those positions. So you'll find some on his waist. You see that little bump there. That's kind of indicating first there is like gravity pulling the shirt down, but then it's loose towards the end, so changing the shape, recall to the previous tip. But then you have the stretch lines kind of in the direction of the belt, and you even have some bumps kind of in front of the belt to make it seem a lot more natural. And then he's bending his right knee towards us a little bit, so you have bumps and lines going towards there, because that the bend there is the most dramatic. And so the more dramatic the bend of the limb or like the joint, the more dramatic the lines and the bumps. So that means that point of touch or motion has a lot of energy, so therefore there will be a lot more like lines and bumps in that direction. Also, we have a bump right before the biceps on his arms, because he's kind of like bending his arm away from the rest of his torso, and then there's usually a bump there. If his hands were like going straight down, there'll be less of that. You see the flag he's holding, the parts that really hold the flag tightest, those parts have the lines pointing towards him. So that's like closer to his where his fist begins, and then closer to the top of the stick he's holding with the flag. And then you have a little flow motion of the flag itself because of the wind. And now we're just erasing what's underneath. Again, a recall to tip 1. See, most of those lines are from, you see, in the armpit, belts, and those are places where there's a point of motion, because even the belt is touching the clothing and making things a whole lot tighter in the waist area. So here we have something like a tent. I'm having like a basic shape to give me an idea of how the tent's gonna look anyways, regardless. So this is almost like, simplifying it with guidelines before I actually draw it. And it would be this exact shape if the tent was stretched out completely. But the nail hitting it to the floor is kind of like a point of motion. So you will have like lines pointing towards that. And then I don't want it to be too stretched out. I don't want the tent to be too stretched out, so the line's not going to be straight. It's going to have a slight curve to it, because gravity is pulling it down, so it's going to have a curve towards that direction. If the wind was blowing, say, from the left to the right, the curve will be in the opposite direction. Here, based off of our studies, we want to mimic cloth a little more, or materials like materials for tents a little more, even though it's a little thicker than just cloth. But we have those lines again to the point of motion at the top, and putting some shading, which could be a video on its own. And once you do those based off of the studies that you've done and your style and things of that nature, it makes things a whole lot easier. I'm gonna have a character peeking out of the tent just to keep things a little fun. You guys can leave a comment on what you think the character is saying. Basically caption this. Tip 6, winds can also dictate the flow, folds, and movement of the material it interacts with, especially if the winds are stronger than the material itself. And that's basically evident with the flag that he's holding. And if you have a design on the flag, you also have to keep that in mind when you slap it on. You don't want to have it seem flat on something that's not flat in surface. Tip 7, don't add too many folds, wrinkles, and bumps, especially when they're not necessary. And I see these, you know, a lot, especially in like really new creators, especially when you're trying to draw Dragon Ball Z pants. Unless that's the style you're going for, in some cases I admit it could be applicable, but in most cases it's not, especially if you're going for something realistic or semi-realistic. So stuff like this, not good. So too many bumps, why those bumps happen, stretch lines and streamlines and all those lines to indicate fold and things of that nature. They're actually not terrible, but like those are not good. Everything here does, you know, doesn't work. You kind of have to take your time with things and understand them, and then you know the right places to put those lines. So you have the bumps right before the tuck in, and then you have the lines indicating that the pants are being tucked in the shoe area. Have a little bump in areas that will bend, so that's where the leg would kind of bend forward, so you have a little bump there. It's almost like the clothing remembers as well. That's a bonus tip. The clothing remembers. If you bend that part of your clothes a lot, sometimes you could be standing straight and a bump would be there regardless, right? That's a bonus tip. And then, you know, you have the lines, putting the lines in the correct places. The belt tying the pants together is also cloth material, so there's like stretch lines in the knot. There's stretch lines right before the knot, stretch lines for the part of the belt that's tying everything up as it's coming out of the knot. There's stretch lines there as well for parts that are going to be folding. You kind of have to look at that and maybe even study actual belts that tie like that, maybe like people wearing karate costumes, or what you're trying to draw, Dragon Ball, and like look at those lines and see where the creator puts in bumps and lines. Tip 8, different materials have different characteristics. So the way, say, leather would fold, bend, flow with the wind is different from the way, say, silk or jeans would do so. And this is also a slight recall to tip 2. Here we have a character. This is an original character from my series BACASSI, but the jacket especially has several different materials patched together. There's parts of it that's fur, there's parts of it that's leather, and in fact some of the leather has parts that are thicker than others, as you will see. So yeah, put in the fur. Again, how we shade it, you know, how we put that together depends, right, to help depict that type of material. Fur, so fur is shaded differently, fur folds differently, the streamlines will show in a very different way. You know, it depends on the style you're using to draw in general. And here with the leather, there's a way leather folds. I highly recommend you guys like look at leather people in leather jackets, and sometimes even suits do the same thing. It folds in this really cool way that's not as straightforward as just say linen, right? Leather or silk. Leather folds in a unique way, as we'll see here. And so I'm using a much more darker tone of a pencil here to help show that, and like it's just different. The lines are different. It's almost like using the white parts to show where the stretch lines are, and then the other parts, the negative parts, would just be black. So it's something I highly recommend you look up, and it's something you wouldn't know unless you actually study up. So obviously we have two materials patched up together. We have fur, obviously having different characteristics than leather. Again, that depends on art style, which we will get into next. Tip 9, art styles matter. So Know if you're trying to do something more realistic or stylized, and this will affect how you render the drawing. For example, light streamlines help indicate sewing. They could be dotted, connected, or both, depending on your art style. And here, the style I'm using for this video, of course, is mine and maybe a blend of others, but it's not 100% realistic, so there are certain liberties that are being taken. And it's a blend between realistic and the simplified with a dash of style. Some of these illustrations are me mimicking, the styles of other popular creators, but especially drawing the actual clothes themselves, it's mostly my style. And here with this style of like drawing leather and fur, especially the leather part, I don't see it too much, especially in manga, but it is there, especially with the more seinen titles. And then seinen titles tend to have more detailed styles of drawing versus, say, shonen. And for those who don't know, seinen titles are just mature manga, really. To simplify it, it's more complicated than that, but to simplify, that's what I mean. Just more mature titles and series in themes like Vagabond and things of that nature. And the style is also kind of influenced by what I've seen in the studies I've done when drawing all these material, and I'm taking the parts that I like and putting it all together. I'll have a new updated video on how to find your art style for those who are interested in that. Again, I feel like that's a separate video, and I don't want to make this video longer than it already is. Tip 10, understand and study folds, including the popular designs in fashion. So like look at fashion just in general, especially depending on what era you're trying to depict, and then take some pointers. Some designs are symbolic, and so knowing what they symbolize would help you understand when to apply symbolism. Color and material especially symbolize certain things and can translate to rich meanings, but this is more of a character design issue, so maybe I leave most of this kind of talk for a different video. But it's good to know, and so you should study the fashions of these eras that interest you, and then some, and then practice with them. And the more practice you do, similar to what we discussed at the start of the video, the better you're going to be. You're not just going to breeze through all of this because you watched one video. You actually have to put hand to paper and practice, and draw, maybe with reference, and then without reference, test where test yourself and know where your errors are, studying the references with the goal of not needing the references every time you need to draw. That mentality applies to everything, but in this case, especially cloth, clothing, wrinkles, folds, etc. To close out, I'll do a little quick recap. And so here we have the tie. You can see the tie after the knot. You see some stretch lines to indicate a tuck in. We can't really see a bump as much, especially from this distance, but there might be a tiny bump right there during the rest of the tie. Again, thinking in layers, going back to tip 1, we're trying to show what would be underneath the clothing here, because this character, I'm going to have a jacket go over everything. But again, thinking in layers, this is how maybe things might look as a rough sketch without the jacket. Like just a real quick sketch, buttons there and blah blah blah, right? But I'm going to erase that because the jacket is going to cover it anyway. I've done this enough to where I can skip that part and just go straight to the jacket. This is what we're going to do here. And so there will be a cut there because the jacket is going to be all buttoned up. Again, I have a little bump there because point of touch, you can see his hands touching there. So you have bump and you have some stretch lines there. Again, exactly where to put these things will also come with experience and practice and doing studies. Again, another bump there, point of touch. He has his hands kind of on his waist to a degree. And you maybe even have some folds go and overlap the hand to really give it more depth. Again, that's a point of touch or motion. Putting the rest of the jacket, it depends on, we could have made any jacket, but this is the jacket we have. We already have, basically the jacket is designed already. And now we're just slapping it onto this mannequin. You see right there, you always want to have lines overlap. You don't want everything to seem very flat. You have a bump right before the arm begins. That's a streamline right there. Again, it doesn't connect completely, and that's how I have it in my style. And that's just the parts where the two materials meet. In this case, the same material, but that's where two parts meet. We have stretch lines in the usual suspect places, armpits where the arm bends, and then how it folds exactly, we can like wing it, but at the same time we've done enough studies to inform us of how to do it properly. Have a little bump before the bicep begins again because it's bending. right there, and it's bending again in the elbow area. Again, bump. We have informed, studied fold lines. I think that's the best way to put it. Again, we know where to put the bumps, right? And again, with the tips, that should also help you know where to put the bumps as well. We have buttons. The jacket is kind of fitted, so the jacket is for the most part in tune with the shape of his body. So there's going to be stretch lines in some places that feel stretched. Again, with the buttons, is a point of touch or motion, so we have those kind of lines. We have the stretch lines there as well to indicate a little bit of stretch because the jacket is so fitted. Again, going back to tips that we've already gone over. It's a point of touch, but there's also stretch fold lines there. And depending on the perspective we're looking at this character, we're going to see some bumps. And then we have these lines to indicate the design of the jacket. And again, because the jacket is just going to be straight lines, but we're not just going to draw straight lines, right? It's great because these lines are also helping show the bumps that we can't see from our perspective. It wouldn't just be straight lines, because there are bumps there. You know where to put the bump and then have it be straight, and then bump again and have it be straight, depending on your style. So you're basically putting the design on the clothing with the surface in mind. And now we just erase what's underneath and we're done. And that's all, folks. Please, if you like this video in any way, don't forget the United States to smash that subscribe button, hit the like button, and that bell so you stay notified each time I upload absolutely anything. You can read my comic Apple Black, published and serialized on Saturday AM, as well as checking out all the other comics that we publish on our roster. Links to my social media, Instagram, all that good stuff, all the links you could possibly need, and more will be in the description below. You can also get 2 free months of Skillshare free. You're welcome. I'd like to thank my patrons who voted for me to make this video. Arrow, Alec, Allen, Ayosafu, at Ayosafu on IG. Arrow, Ayosafu, Fado, Grish, Hackwolf, Minji Art, Pat O, Sarah, Tony, Ryan, Wear My Crown, and more. You guys are lit! So White Manga, and I'm out.